It was nearing midnight when Jackson eased his way into the quiet house on the outskirts of town. The windows were cracked, revealing faint light from a dimmed lamp. He wasn't a professional kidnapper, but he knew enough to get the job done. He had debts, large, dangerous debts, and he needed a quick payday. Sarah Novak was his ticket. The daughter of a wealthy businessman, she was the perfect target. Reclusive, predictable, and often home alone. Jackson had studied her movements for weeks, and tonight, when her parents were away, was his opportunity. Creeping through the shadows, he entered her room, a rag soaked with chloroform in hand. Sarah barely had time to turn before her world went black. When she woke, she was tied to a chair in an abandoned cabin. Her wrists throbbed where the rope dug into her skin. The room was dimly lit, and she could hear the sound of dripping water nearby. Jackson stood in the corner, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice rough, almost hesitant. "I just need your dad to pay up. Once he does, you'll be free to go." Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her gaze steady. "What if he doesn't pay?" Jackson shifted uncomfortably. "He will. He has to." Days passed, each more unbearable than the last. Sarah's father, instead of agreeing to the ransom, had stalled. Negotiating, hesitating. The tension in the cabin mounted. Jackson paced the small space constantly, his patience wearing thin. His desperation was clear, and Sarah, perceptive by nature, began to understand that Jackson wasn't the monster she had first imagined. He was scared, caught in a situation spiraling out of control. "You don't want to do this, do you?" Sarah asked one evening, watching him from her corner of the room. He glared at her but didn't respond. "I've been thinking," she continued, her voice calm despite the tremor in her hands. "If my father isn't paying quickly, there's something wrong. He should have done it by now. He's ruthless with money, and you can't afford to wait much longer. This isn't going to end well for either of us." Jackson stopped pacing, rubbing the back of his neck, clearly conflicted. "I don't have a choice," he muttered. "I owe some bad people a lot of money. This was my only way out." For the first time since her abduction, Sarah saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. And with that, a plan began to form in her mind. She didn't know if it would work, but doing nothing was no longer an option. "You could help me escape," she said slowly. "Then we could both disappear. I know how to hide. My father wouldn't expect me to work with you, and he'll eventually give up." Jackson stared at her as if she were mad. "You want me to help you escape?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, it's your best chance. They're probably watching you too. You can't stay here." He paced again, running a hand through his messy hair, but the idea had taken root. There were no good options left. If her father wasn't paying, Jackson knew that the people he owed would come for him soon, and they wouldn't care who got hurt in the process. "I'll cut you loose," he said, grabbing a knife from the table. "But if you try anything, this will go bad fast." Sarah stayed still as Jackson approached. With a few quick movements, the ropes binding her wrists and ankles fell away. She rubbed her sore skin and stood cautiously. They didn't have much time. Together, they gathered what little supplies they could find. Jackson was jumpy, his nerves shot, but Sarah remained calm. She had always been a thinker, someone who planned ahead, and now that the situation had shifted, she felt oddly in control. They moved through the woods under the cover of darkness, the cabin soon fading behind them. Jackson led the way, but it was clear that Sarah had become more than just a hostage. She was now his partner in escape. Hours later, they reached the outskirts of a small, desolate town. Exhausted and out of options, they ducked into a rundown motel. Jackson slumped against the wall, his face a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "You really think this will work?" he asked, staring at Sarah. She shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "We'll have to see. But right now, we're in this together." For the first time since their paths had crossed, Jackson felt a strange sense of relief. The girl he had kidnapped was now his only ally in a world that had turned against him. It wasn't the life he had planned, but as Sarah sat next to him, plotting their next move, Jackson realized that maybe, just maybe, There was a way out for both of them. The cheap motel room felt like a fragile shelter against the storm brewing around them. Sarah sat on the bed, her fingers moving idly over her phone, now free of any restraints. Jackson had smashed the SIM card earlier to make sure it couldn't be traced. There was no turning back. "We can't stay here long," she said, glancing toward the window. The curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze, a reminder of the world outside, hunting them both. Jackson stood near the door, tense, as if expecting someone to break in at any moment. His eyes were dark with exhaustion, but fear still kept him alert. "Your father will send people soon," Sarah continued. "He doesn't negotiate. If he's stalled this long, he's either planning something or has already hired someone to find me." Jackson didn't respond immediately, but he knew she was right. His hands twitched at his sides, the weight of the situation pressing harder. He wasn't built for this kind of life, the hiding, the running. What had started as a desperate gamble was quickly spiraling into something far more dangerous. "What's your plan?" he finally asked. The question surprised them both, an admission that Sarah, the hostage, had become the one guiding their fate. Sarah glanced at him, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had been thinking about it ever since they left the cabin, weighing their limited options. "We need leverage," she said, her voice calm but certain. "My father, he won't care about me if there's no gain for him. But if we take something valuable, something he can't replace, he'll have to deal with us directly." Jackson blinked, confused. Like what? What could be more valuable to him than his daughter? "His money," Sarah replied. "His empire. I know how to access his accounts." Jackson stared at her, dumbfounded. You can do that?" Sarah nodded. "I've had access for years, since I was old enough to start learning about his business. He trusts me to follow in his footsteps, but what he doesn't know is I've memorized the passwords to everything. I can drain his accounts, or at least enough to get his attention. And when he realizes I have the upper hand, he'll negotiate. On our terms." Jackson was silent, processing the unexpected shift in their dynamic. The girl he had kidnapped wasn't the helpless victim he had expected. She was calculating, methodical, and now, as strange as it seemed, she was offering him a way out. "And then what?" Jackson asked, still skeptical. "Once you get the money, we'll be hunted by more than just your father. This isn't going to end well. We'll disappear," Sarah said quietly, her eyes fixed on him. "I've thought about it for years. How to get away from my father's control. You're right about one thing, he's dangerous, and I'm tired of living under his shadow. This is my chance to break free. But I can't do it alone." Jackson leaned against the wall, folding his arms across his chest. His whole life had been about survival, scraping by, taking risks, making enemies he could never outrun. Now, a rich girl he'd taken hostage was offering him something he hadn't expected. An escape from the mess he'd created, from the people he owed, and from the hopeless life he had been living. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his messy hair. "All right," he said finally. "If you're serious about this, I'm in. But we need to move fast. Your father's people could be tracking us already." Sarah stood, crossing the room to the small table where her laptop sat. She had kept it hidden in her bag, convincing Jackson to let her bring it along by claiming she needed it for personal reasons. Now it was their lifeline. As the screen lit up, Sarah's fingers danced across the keys. "I'll need time to break through some of the security layers, but once I'm in, we can transfer the funds into an untraceable account. I've already set up a dummy corporation. My father will never know where the money went until it's too late." Jackson watched her work, amazed by how calmly she handled it all. The Sarah he had kidnapped was gone. This new version of her, sharp and determined, made him wonder if maybe she had been waiting for something like this all along. A catalyst to break free from her gilded cage. Hours passed in tense silence as Sarah hacked into her father's accounts. Jackson kept a close eye on the door, every creak of the floorboards making his heart race. They both knew they were living on borrowed time. When the transfer finally went through, Sarah let out a slow breath, relief washing over her. "It's done," she said, leaning back in the chair. "We've got the funds. Now we need to disappear." Jackson nodded, already packing their few belongings. We head south, he suggested. I know some people who can help us lay low. It won't be glamorous, but it'll keep us safe for a while. Sarah stood, her resolve hardening. Let's go. As they stepped out of the motel room and into the night, they were no longer kidnapper and hostage. They were allies, bound together by circumstance and necessity. Both had been trapped. Jackson by his debts, Sarah by her father. And now, for the first time, they had a chance to escape. But the world was closing in, and the path ahead was anything but certain. Together, they would have to face whatever came next. The sun was beginning to rise as Jackson and Sarah sped down the empty highway, leaving the motel and their old lives behind. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, but the silence between them buzzed with the weight of what they had just done. Sarah leaned her head against the window, watching the landscape blur past. Her heart pounded with a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. They had transferred millions from her father's accounts. Money that would take him days to notice was missing. By then, they would be long gone. Jackson glanced at her, his face grim but focused. You think your father's just going to let this go? Sarah shook her head. No. He'll come after us. He'll send people who won't stop until we're found. But by then, we'll be ghosts. You sure about that? Jackson asked. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. He had been running for most of his life, but this was different. The stakes were higher, the danger more intense. Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes steady. I'm sure. I've spent years planning for this, waiting for the moment when I could get out. My father can't control me anymore. And with that money, we have leverage. Enough to start over, disappear completely. Jackson said nothing, but her words struck a chord. He had been living on the edge for so long, it felt surreal to think about escape as something real. But here they were, two unlikely partners on the run with stolen millions. Hours passed as they headed south, the tension in the car mounting. Jackson's paranoia made them switch routes, take detours through back roads, and stop at random gas stations to avoid being traced. By the time they crossed the state line, exhaustion was setting in, and they decided to pull into a remote rest stop to regroup. Sarah got out first, stretching her legs and breathing in the fresh air. Jackson followed, his eyes scanning the area, always on high alert. We can't keep running forever, he muttered, leaning against the car. At some point, we're going to have to lay down roots, find a place to settle. But with your father's people after us, I don't see how that's going to happen. Sarah nodded, her gaze distant. I've been thinking about that. There's one last thing we can do to end this, for good. Jackson raised an eyebrow. What's that? She hesitated, then finally spoke. We need to disappear in a way no one expects. My father's people are looking for us together. But what if we make it look like we turned on each other? If I stage my death, they'll stop looking for me. And without me, they'll assume you've run off on your own. They'll stop hunting you. Jackson frowned, disbelief flickering across his face. Stage your death? That's insane. It's the only way, Sarah insisted. If they think I'm dead, they'll stop caring about where I am. And they won't keep chasing you, thinking you still have me. He paced, rubbing his hands over his face. You're talking about faking your death like it's nothing. This isn't some movie, Sarah. She stepped closer, her voice steady. I know it's dangerous, but we're out of options. We can create a scene, make it look like I drowned or fell, something plausible. You disappear after that, take the money and start fresh. They'll never come after you again. Jackson stared at her, his mind racing. It was a crazy idea, but there was logic behind it. He could see the determination in her eyes. She was willing to go all the way, even if it meant leaving everything behind for good. You really think it'll work? He asked quietly. I do, she replied. But it has to look real. We need to make them believe it. Later that night, they reached a secluded cliff by the coast, the waves crashing against the rocks below. It was a perfect spot, remote with no witnesses, just as they had planned. Jackson set the scene, tossing some of Sarah's personal belongings, her jacket, phone, and a few items from the car, near the edge. Sarah stood at the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping through her hair. She stared down at the water, knowing that this was the moment she would vanish. Her father would assume she was dead, the authorities would stop looking, and Jackson could escape without her. "Are you ready?" Jackson asked, his voice low. She took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm ready." He handed her a rope, which they had tied securely around a nearby rock. "Once you're in the water, follow the rope down to the cave. Stay there until I'm sure it's clear." Sarah took the rope, her heart racing. She trusted Jackson, more than she had ever expected to, but this plan had to go perfectly. If anything went wrong, her father's men would find them, and there would be no second chances. Without another word, Sarah climbed down the rocks and lowered herself into the freezing water. The cold shocked her system, but she gripped the rope tightly and submerged herself, disappearing beneath the waves. Jackson stood at the edge, his hands trembling. He stared out at the dark sea, watching the water churn violently below. After a few tense minutes, he turned and walked back to the car, leaving behind the evidence of Sarah's supposed death. It had to look convincing. He had to sell it. When he drove off, headlights cutting through the night, Sarah was already making her way through the underwater cave. She would wait there for hours if she had to, until Jackson returned to signal the all-clear. Together, they would split up, disappear, and start new lives far from her father's reach. As the car's taillights vanished into the distance, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. Sarah knew there was no turning back now. She wasn't the girl she had been before this all started. They had become allies, partners in survival. And from now on, they would be nothing more than ghosts.